Maybe I'll just talk a little bit about who I am and how I got to here. Back in the old days, I was telling my friend over there that we're still using dog teams and no skidoos. We got our own wood, check our own nets, and go for muskrat hunting and caribou hunting. And that's the kind of life that we live before the road came in. And when the road came in, a lot of things changed. But in the old days, we had our names that were given to us, and I didn't know I had an English name until I entered school, and then I ended up having two names, and then over time I realized that the original name is what the community knows you by, and the other one is for your ID for government services, and that's the way it goes. Anyways, in the early 1965 was the first time I went to residential school, and I stayed there for altogether about 4 years. So I kind of have a good idea of what people are talking about when they talk about the impacts. But I ended up going to high school because the school in my community only went to grade 8. So now I had to go back out and going to a larger center and staying at the residential over there. And it was one of those places where it was a little bit more freer. You can actually go home for the weekend because I wasn't very far from the city. And so I caught a ride with one of my uncles that happened to be there, and there's only maybe a handful of vehicles from my community. And after the weekend was over, his car broke down, and there's no way of going back, and it's in the middle of winter, so you can't really walk. So I ended up staying, and nobody really reported me missing, the school or even the residents. And I had to kind of sneak in the fall time, in the springtime, to get my basic stuff back. I don't think they know I went there. Maybe they reported something stolen, I don't know. But I needed my clothes, I had to change. Anyways, a few years ago, I got invited to that same school. So I went there with some other dignitaries. I guess I became a dignitary. And they were putting up a portrait of me in a main hall, right? And that's how crazy it gets, that my picture would end up in a main hall in that high school that didn't report me missing. Yeah. Anyways, so after I kind of dropped out, had to go to work, and the only work that I could get at the time was sitting at night in a school that didn't have beyond grade 8. So I ended up guarding the school at night, you know. I did that for about 5 months. It's just night work and daytime sleeping, so I didn't have any social life. And but there was an old engineer sitting there, and when I showed up, he'll clock me in, and I'll pick up a book and start reading all night. And then after a while, he said, "Well, you can read." "Yeah, I can read." "Oh, what else is there to do? There's no TV, no radio. Lots to read, though." "Well, if you can read, you can probably read a course." "Okay, sure, I'll give that a try." So I sent it off to SAIT in Calgary, and about 5 months later, I became an engineer. I became an engineer, 4th class stationary engineer, certified, and big certificate on the wall. And now they shift me to a day shift. So now I'm starting to walk the schools in the daytime, going to check these plants all over the place. And in the evening shift, I was doing the same thing. Then I noticed that the superintendent of the school had come in, and he was meeting with these elders in a small elementary seminar room with these little chairs. And they're all sitting there, and there's this old guy, superintendent, standing in front of this sheet talking about the changes to the education system and how they're going to introduce more things. But there was no interpreter, and so they're staring at each other. And I was walking by, and so superintendent tells, come on over. So I went there, and I started interpreting for those old guys, and because I can speak fluently. And I started interpreting, and they said, well, next time we have a meeting, we'll come on over. You'll interpret for us. So I became an interpreter. I became an interpreter while I was at that school. Somebody was delivering fuel. So I started talking to the guy and said, you own the truck? Yeah. Well, if I bought fuel off you, can you sell it to me? Sure, I'll sell you. Where's your barrel? Right there, fill it up. And so I was going through a lot of fuel. I said, well, if I start a gas station, will you sell me fuel? I said, sure. And then I think when I was 21, I started the gas station. So I became a businessman. But at the same time, the elders were becoming organized because I wasn't really interpreting what the superintendent was talking about after. I was interpreting their intentions of encroachment, right? And so I became an advisor. I'm still an advisor. See my title. And so they said, well, we want to get a little bit more organized, so let's get a tribal thing going. And so we worked towards that with some of my buddies and with the old people. We started this tribal council, formal so that there's monies coming in and out. And we need a chairman, so you be the chairman now. So I became a chairman. And after we came organized, we got some monies, and when we had to hire staff. And so we hired staff, and after a while, he moved on, and so now we got to hire some. No, just take it, you do it. And so I ended up becoming an executive director. So I was doing that, and then we're getting into the big, that's when I found out there was a claim going on, right? Because I can see the correspondence now. Big claim going on in the territory, and one of the people representing us became a chief negotiator. You probably know who he was. And so the vacancy for regional negotiator became empty, so I brought it up to a meeting that this is vacancy. Well, take it. So I became a chief negotiator. Well, a regional negotiator, right? A regional negotiator, and then we started the big Métis Nation fell apart. Their claim fell apart, so we started reorganizing our region for a regional claim. And once we did a statement of claim, we organized our first big meeting, and we brought all the elders together, and they made a motion that we were going to seek to do a regional claim. So we did this big motion and invited all kinds of people. And Tom Sidden came in, we gave it to him, said, sure, we'll go for it. And that's the way it happened. So now we're in a regional claim, and now we need a chief negotiator. Well, I'll take it. So I became a chief negotiator. And once we settled the claim in 2005, it took us about 13 years. I spent a lot of time in Ottawa, so I have no interest in walking past my bedroom now. So we did this claim, and all the stuff that goes with the claim including setting up the Constitution, setting up the structure, setting up the finances, setting up the assembly, the chief's assembly, the elders, bank accounts, and the transfer of band council assets and liabilities from the 4 bands. And it would take effect, bang, in one day. When, on the effective date, it got shifted all over. And so that day came when we didn't have, my job as chief negotiator ended that day. And then the next day, the government started. They didn't have a chief executive officer, so they said, well, take it. So that's how I ended up being a CEO for about 4 years. And I was kind of getting tired after about 4 years, so I thought maybe I'll step back. Well, I can't step back. Well, create a position called senior advisor. You take it. So I never had to apply for a job. So the story that I'm going to tell you is things that I've heard, okay, over time, and things that has kind of informed us as to where we're going to go. But one of the things that the elders told me when I first started is that you need to spend more time on the land because that's who we were before the impact, okay? And all the things that have happened since then is a record of that impact. And what we're trying to achieve is an extension to who we were, including all the impacts that we had, because those are the measurements that we need to concentrate on and reconciliate so that it becomes what's ours is ours and what's theirs is theirs. That's what the story is about. So one of the first things that we had to do was spend most of the summer in the bush with the elders and the youth in canoes, traveling the old trails and listening to the stories and starting off from there. And the original story is about the animals and the people when they spoke one language and they coexisted in an environment where it was that you needed each other. And so that story is what we call our legends about our relationship with the animals, because before Christianity, most of our names were after the animals, or parts of animals, or skills of animals. So it's not unusual to find a lot of animal names associated before Christianity. Before John, James, and Mary took over. Anyways, the story is that all the animals and people came together to determine who they're going to be from now on. And so that's the beginning of our written story on a landscape, because that's where it got recorded. And when they came together, some of the legend stories is who wanted to be a fish. Like an example would be a moose hunter wanted to be a trout. So he took all the parts of a moose, including his tools, and embedded it into the head of the trout. So that every time we take a trout out of the lake, we cook the head, they would eat it, and then they'll lay out the bones so that the trout can tell its own story. And that goes with many other animals too, okay? So that the act of coexisting with the animals is a reality, that if we're going to go anywhere in a landscape where the fish habitat or where the caribou crossing is, or where the moose go to their salt licks, and where the fish occupy different parts of the thing, that place names are, the oldest place names are to protect and give recognition to the animals that are there that you rely on. And so there was no names of people in the landscape before contact. But because animals and people separated, there was a conflict between the two. And then we have these stories of these places, and they all have different names. Like, let's say here would be Kwedu, Yamuzai Kidatlata, Ikedatlakwa, and Indaketi. All these names is where Yamuza was more like, lack of a better word in English, a cultural hero. And so his travels was where the story of where they came to be discovered by an elder, and eventually they turned their grandfather into a mountain. And so today, if you go there, you can climb to the top with the instruction of elders. You drop a stone into the old man's head, and it'll tell you whether the land is comfortable with you or not. And if you don't hear anything, it means that maybe you should change your life a bit because you're going down the wrong path. But if the land acknowledges you by making a sound, then you're on the right path, that you should become a teacher. And so this is a story of Yamuza's travel into the landscape, making these sacred sites, which we still go to today to make these offerings, where there are abundance of fish and the stories that go with it. And all these place names has to do with coexisting with the animals in the landscape. And by coexisting with them, it means that the place names, the way you use trees, the substance of soil, and how you match those names together determines the type of fish in that lake and where to harvest it. All that information packed into that information. So my last pretty close to 30 years of going into the bush, I've visited all these sites and picked up all the stories, and I discovered there was a pattern, because the elders are saying that the land will tell you itself the story of who we are, and we're looking for an extension of that. But in that extension, there has been very many impacts that need to be reconciled. And so this is a story before contact, and this is where the Aboriginal rights, or now Indigenous rights and titles, comes from, the original ones. But there has been an impact because back in 1492, somebody got lost and hit the shores of South America and started shooting. Anyways, anytime anybody goes anywhere, like if I go to Ottawa, I'll need to eat, I'll need to find a place to stay, need to do things. It means that I have to now having an impact into this area, or it could be any nation in Canada, that the first drawdown happened. Resources, decision-making, isolation. They were followed by the Crown Corporation, the early one, 1670, of the HBC, of the trade, and they started drawing down the usage of animals and what should be used for trade, and the trade routes, setting up these communities, so that anytime you hear of a Fort Edmonton or Fort Reliance, it's because they were established by the trade. And if it says lake at the end of it, it means that it's an Aboriginal community, okay? And that's how you can tell. And so these are the impacts recorded in the landscape, which is not part of the original, but we measured the impact that was happening at the time, to the point where in here, because of the new ways of doing things with rifles and things like that, you introduce rifle and things, tools to First Nations that protected their territory. It creates conflict, you know. So that conflict was also recorded, including the trade that followed, and including the treaties, okay? And the treaties is something that's different because not only before we got there, that in 1763, the story of 1763, Canada eventually took over, to make the story short, that a lot of land was being exchanged without any authorization, and so the authority, Great Britain, took it upon themselves to create this proclamation to say it's only through us that you can have access to these lands, and we'll deal with the Indians. And so that's the beginning of the unnumbered treaties. To have access to those lands, they did it through treaties. And that continued until 1867. The unnumbered treaties stopped then, and Canada became delegated to do treaties on behalf of the Crown. And so that's the big difference between international treaty and domestic treaty. And so with this new decision-making powers, more stuff was drawn down, and eventually, probably in 1870, I wasn't there, so I don't have the exact dates, but that's what the Wikipedia says. So that those things was a creation of the Indian Act, and then eventually the provinces kind of came on stream. And the way Canada operates is that because now they have access to all these Canada lands, that they operate by entities, universities, crown corporations, mining companies, NGOs. They all collect the money from the resources, and they redistribute through employment, and everybody pays the taxes, and it goes back to Canada, and they redistribute for social networks, and the game starts over every year. And eventually, the provinces, once they got recognized, started doing the same thing, that if you want to operate, well, you have to more take out the provincial type jurisdiction to operate within. And everybody pays those kind of taxes, and that's how they operate, but it's more on the municipal side. And somewhere in this thing here, all these resources are being fed to these things, but this is for Canadians, the taxpayers, the voters, the ones that came over with their rights from overseas and gave recognition to that through citizenship, and the provinces in the areas that you live in. But where do the Indians fit in? None. They don't fit anywhere. And so this is where the Indian Act created a bubble. So this is where we are, okay? And the only way to that bubble is through the Indian agent, through Indian Affairs. And the only people they authorize to go into that bubble to remove anybody would be the churches who are a part of the entities of government. They were delegated or authorized to go there, and that's how the beginning of the residential school started. Okay. So we didn't vote till 1961, and if you wanted to leave here into this society, you needed a permit. That's where those permit things come in. You want to go explore, you want to go to the bar, you can't go in because it's illegal for you to drink. Well, come on in, just leave your status by the door. If you lose it, that's fine. You know, that's the way life was. If you wanted to go join the army, well, come on in, put on your suit and leave your status outside. You might get lost, but what the hell? Come and join us. And that's part of losing our status, right? This was where we started learning how to make our teepees from tarp, right? That we've become part of the system in this bubble that we're not part of. And if you made any decision, you have to send it in an official form called Band Council Resolution. In a form that's developed by Indian Affairs, everybody has to sign and write down what the decision is and send it over there. They look at it, oh, they're operating just the way we designed it, send them more money, right? And if we have a problem with our recent election, we'll phone up and say, Houston, we got a problem. Can you come over and make a determination for us? Because we're fighting. This thing is not ours, it's yours. And so that's the way it is. And this was a form of recognition, even though it's an ugly thing. But it's based on something that was the foundation of all those things that are built up on this side is because of the treaties that give some form of recognition to here without implementing. Instead of implementing a treaty that gives authority or gives recognition to what was there before, it became more like, let's wipe them out. But make sure that they receive their services down here. They have to go there and make their decisions, then run back to their community. So that even till today, if your Indian Affairs is coming in with a treaty commissioner sitting down at a table like this, after it's all over, the chief shows up, they'll give him a Canadian flag like they have all the time, because in the old days, every time the official showed up, they know where the flag is and they know where the chief is. Okay, and they still do that. They still give you a flag. And the chief would get what they call a government chief suit. And the only time they wore it in my area was when treaty came and they had to put on the suit so that the government recognizes who the chief is. And so when we're going through self-government, we threw those things out. It no longer applies to us because we're not part of the Indian Act anymore to determine who, what your services are, but we kept a part of the Indian Act that determines who an Indian is because there's rights attached to it that still needs to be worked out, that has to do with health, education, and social services. So so the idea is that in 1982, with the patriation of the Canadian Constitution, it opened up a whole new ball game, which is like the comprehensive claims for the areas that didn't have treaties, or the ones that had treaties but were never implemented. And so in the north, what are we going to do with a cow anyways? It's frozen in a winter and there's no grass. We don't have barns either. but we need fishnets. And so that's how we ended up getting our fishnets. So in 1982, we started getting into a land claim because this is what you're trying to fulfill, is the spirit and intent of the treaties. The written version is what they believe in. But we know that we have been making our own agreements with the original inhabitants of the landscape, which is the animals. Our laws are written on the land. Our relationship with other Aboriginal groups among us, we also have an agreement, and we dealt with the early trade by setting up our systems so that we can have a collective trade. And we would have respect for other Aboriginal groups, and we were represented at the time of treaty through our leader. So we have names for each one of them, of the leaders that were there before. And even till where our claim is today, which is an extension of who we are, despite all the things that were drawn down. So when you do an agreement, people assume that we're going to get everything back all in one shot. But all these drawdowns are embedded in federal and territorial legislation, okay? And it takes 300 members to debate a little piece of it in the House of Commons, and even more or less at the provincial level, because they not only drew down, but they transferred a lot to each other, and even all the way down to municipalities. So it's very complex. And so we're finding that there is no system of implementation even after treaties, or any kind of treaties. There's none. And so the big thing is to try to find, for and with government now, an implementation plan or an implementation policy, so that we can get away from the only method of implementation that's available to us now is if you start arguing, then you end up in the courts. And it's the courts that make that determination, but you still have to implement what the court says, so it goes around another circle. All these activities is something that we've all have listed in our landscape anyways. So we know what they are. We know where our rights are embedded. But we need the funds, we need the system of governance, and we already have a system of governance that we had recorded that were the leaders of our time leading up to where we are today. And so, and when our representative sat down with government for the first time to work out the treaties, they had the written one that came in, but our treaties have always been oral, and we kept a record of it on the landscape. And so they did their version. We didn't agree, representative didn't agree, so he said that, okay, well, one, we have no access to over there. You know, we're talking 1921. You weren't able to vote till 1961, and you don't belong to this system, and you're going to be put in this bubble anyways, or you already were, is that we'll just leave words behind so that the fight would continue when we become recognizable. And so that words ring and echo right across Canada in a similar fashion, like as long as the sun rises. as long as the sun rises and the river flows, and this thing doesn't restrict our way of life of moving forward, that we would have the ability to do so, okay? And that's through my travels into the landscape and listening to the elders. They're saying, well, we just need to fulfill our oral version of what our treaty is. And so this land claim became for me as a chief negotiator trying to understand the story a little bit better. And that we can't win all the battles, but we know where those differences are. They're all going one way, that over time, once we set up, get recognition, we're in a period of recognition of the authorities that we have, that we have 27 chapters, and most of those chapters has to do with things that were already drawn down, so that the fights can happen when the openings happen or when opportunities are made through legislation or policies that are recognizable by all the parties. But the traditional government will always be there because it's embedded in your history, language, and culture. But we need a system of decision-making that is recordable, so that when these things are turned around, because a lot of them are the publicness of Canada, that we can also delegate upon ourselves. The same way Canada and the provinces delegated themselves to run your lives, that you should have the ability to go the other way. So your system has to allow for that. And so that there be some element of publicness in traditional government, but not to the traditional government, but with the entity that's the gateway to the publicness, that protects the publicness from taking it over. And so that's where we give recognition to our Grand Chief as the inherent leader that's only chosen by this people up there, with your own election laws that tells you how to do it, and it cannot be challenged in any court except your own. And so we took because the municipalities, the provincial or territorial government had taken over our communities in the 60s while we were still living there, and they took over the housing, they took over the roads, the water deliveries, put up the telephone poles and electricity, and nobody hooked up to it, except the teachers that came in. They had the lights, running water, and we still had the outhouses. And if you had a little bit of money, it became a two-holder outhouse. Because you can get an extra piece of plywood. That probably came from a crate that came with the housing. Anyways, so these, because the territorial government had embedded itself in the community by setting up municipalities and setting up setting up mayors in each community, and they would report to the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and when they make a decision, they use the official form of the NWT called bylaws. Okay, so on the Indian Affairs, it's BCR. On territorial level, it's bylaws. And you report to the minister, they like your report, oh, send us some more money, throw in a fire truck at the same time. That's the way life was. So what we did was we got rid of the community government concept, so that the chief is elected by the citizens only over here, so that it's called a chief and not a mayor, so that when they're sitting in their community, they've took over all the municipal stuff, including the monies, and there's no way the territorial government can come in and confiscate anything except when their monies are threatened. And they can send in an auditor to audit their books because it's their money anyways, but they can't take it apart. And so these four people come in and become the Chief Executive Council, which implements the laws of the Assembly. And then the councilors come in from the communities from over here, and they also move up here, 8 of them, who become the lawmakers for the Tlicho government. But before they move over here, they have to swear to only do this work and nothing to do with this, because this allows for some element of publicness, but you kind of cut it off over here before they take the seat here, so that they can only do this job and nothing to do with this. Okay? And that's the way it works. But people say, well, we should take this apart. Yes, you should take it apart, but for some people, it's the only link that you have to all these services, okay? If you cut it off, then what do you have left? You end up with an empty bag, and what do you fill it out? What about the funding that we were getting before? Minus the BCR, we'll just take the money, and you fit it into your big budget over here, transfer all the band support funds, and make the arrow go the other way for once, okay? Because it was yours in the first place, because all this money that came from the land, developed by the entities, paid through the government, and they gave it back to you and say, well, as taxpayers, that's our money. We want you to report to us. Well, it's not our system, it's yours. You want to release it, go ahead. We'll take you to court. And so we went through that phase. But the other thing is that all the programs that comes with being in this bubble, that they also be transferred to here, so that decision-making for those programs rests with the government. And with Canada, you know, you get your resources, give it to your entities over here for the employment, business opportunities, they share it amongst themselves, but somehow you end up with all the resource revenues. We want to cut of that. And so that becomes part of your budget. Or, you know, all those people that are living in our communities, in our traditional area, everybody pays taxes. We pay taxes. We've been paying taxes all our lives. Well, we want all those taxes at the same time through a taxation agreement. And so we add that to our budget over here and say, okay, why do you lessen that 7% anyways? We preferred everybody pay 7%. Now we're going to only get 5%. And so we now get all the GST back over here. Because there's an element of publicness that allows for an element of publicness that seems to trickle over here but stops at this border, that we are now, things can be delegated to the Tlicho government to implement public programs, okay? So then we have all these public programs that number probably more than what we could raise ourselves. It's big bucks. Canada and GWT, they got monies that they don't need to be responsible for. They can put it up here. So we got out of the Indian Act, except to say what's an Indian, because there are rights of health, education, social services involved. So part of the agreement that we have between ourselves and the Crown and GNWT, the Tlicho agreement, says that we will take over. We're going to have a sub-agreement, which is called the ISA, Intergovernmental Services Agreement, that has to do with the delivery of health, education, and social services. But this is one of the bread and butters of the security net of Canada and Northwest Territories, where everything is so interwoven that it's very difficult it's easy for them to talk about it, but to actually do it, it's going to take years and years and years. Not only for them, but for our people, because we need to build capacity. We need to understand our own agreements first. We need to understand the way the system works, so that whatever we come up with between the two of us is put in the river where it's fluid, it's got time crunches, it's got yearly budgets, and that's where the dialogue is worked out, so that you don't have to give up any of your rights to gain programs, or Canada feels safe enough to say that, well, we're not going to lose any more, but we can share. We can delegate to them, and they can probably do a better job anyways. And so that's how you end up with a structure of government that is not necessarily traditional, but it acts as Trump's wall to protect the environment. They have to climb pretty high, and the drop is even further. That this is a protection against this. But that means that we need to shift our lenses to not continue to ship everybody on this side so that they can be successful, okay? Because we're brain draining, we need to ensure that their stories are embedded, their identity is embedded before they go here, because they'll need that strength to hold themselves up. But with what they gain, they can straddle both sides so that you're strong like two people. But at the same time, you're strengthening yourself. And so this thing is actually, this little doodle is part of our curriculum in the elementary and the high schools in our communities, including, this is an orientation chart for our tribal government. Because what we end up with really is a continuation of the original story, which is, if you pile up all the stories together, it becomes into a sun. And these are my scrapnels. That as long as you remember that we've sunk to a level of almost no return, And how we came back was when people were told that you have nothing left. Just give up this thing and come and join us. We'll be happily ever after. But the idea of giving up your identity, your stories, is much more stronger than the glitter of what you're being enticed with. And so the idea is that get out of there and do this thing, but you're at your lowest level, where the majority of the people in leadership nowadays, a lot of them spent a lot of time under the delegated authority of the churches in education. And so that's the re-education of that has to happen. And because a lot of our traditional elders are gone, we end up with with elders that are reluctant to step forward. Okay, that's what I call the reluctant elders, where you're the only ones left. Come on in. Here, give you a ticket and stay there till 5. We'll draw it at the end of 5. So you're at your lowest. So the chief of 1921, any chief in Canada, were saying that you can only rise when you're at the bottom. So that as long as the sun rises and the rivers flow, and it flows over the original treaty that still has to be fleshed out, the dialogue is still open, and this thing hasn't quite taken over yet. So we still have a chance to reclaim what was rightfully ours so that we can take our own ownership and make our own determination of self-determination. We determine our own thing, and we will reconciliate through our own laws and negotiations all these agreements that we must have between ourselves that doesn't allow Canada to further encroach as they have in the past. There's limitations to our engagements. And so we even have agreements with the mining companies to say, look, it mentions mining in the treaties, it mentions oil and gas in the treaties, that those rights from here will be transferred to them through the force of law. You're a treaty partner. If you're going to dig a hole in our backyard, we want an impact and benefit agreement, so that you're paying it directly to us. And whatever Canada is getting, they've already decided to share with us. And at the territorial level, with devolution, they also are sharing their resource revenues with us. And anything that's found in our area, which is about 39,000 square kilometers, it's about the size of Switzerland without the bank. We have to create our own wealth first. So all these things are being transferred over to here, and one of the things, the reason it happened was people woke up one day because they were threatened. Whether it was deliberate or not, it woke people up nevertheless. And sometimes we say the white paper, all this kind of stuff, but it's double-edged sword. Somebody decided to kick you in the ass and say, wake up, if you don't wake up now, this thing's going to take over. At least fight. And so this whole thing is about developing our warriors to interpret what the original treaty is and come to grips with it. And so I see that continuing even till today, where Canada is saying, well, let's split this in half because there's still some unsettled claims that are still attached to it, but they'll have an opportunity when they're ready. But for the ones who have already settled and into a land claim, we'll separate it so that there's representation of making sure the arrow is going the other way for once. Okay? And that's what that thing is about. And so this thing turns into, like I say, the sun, the river, and this thing doesn't take over, that we would not be restricted from our way of life because we don't know what the future will hold. Same way we didn't quite know, but we had our words of the chief that gave the oral version of the treaty that had to be worked out when he got recognized as a person, that whatever shows up in the future, they would have the ability to bring that in. And so this becomes Well, I call it Gunawu, which is our way of life. And being October 4, 2017, I will put it under copyright because there's lots of appropriation nowadays. So we have a flag. I'm not sure if it'll show up, but we have a sun, a river, and 4 teepees that describe the publicness, but is shielded by the being on the other side of the river, and it allows for future growth. And so the words of the original treaty makers is coming to life, and it's a lot of work. There'll be lots of controversies, but it's work, 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 and work. That's what it is about. And education, 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 a lot more on this side, because this will always be there. And so what I'll do is I'll just do the closing with, boy, it went over, with a video that I did this summer that describes this thing in 5 minutes for free. The story is in the landscape. The only way to really know the story is to go to the land. This is what we inherited. And we have the responsibility to ensure that the inheritance is given to the next generation. To make sure that the original story is not left behind, but is taken with you. In the 60s, when they started moving into here, children might have been shipped out by barge for years on end. And sometimes they came back and a lot of them didn't. To put a stop to it, one of the visionary leaders lobbied for a school in this area so that the kids wouldn't have to leave and lose their language and come back and have to be reintegrated. And now we're retaking back our own destiny. It's really about language, culture, and way of life, nothing else.
Wata wiki alata da wiki gokungola wiki na te wiki dunga hata ze itong wiki tinta dihi songola itong tana ki gawa ta tong eki wiki na hote te yizun ta hong dunga da wadina da di wune te tutong
There is land and the stories that are stored in a landscape. The beating signifies the landscape, and the landscape is interwoven with the hides of the animals from the landscape. And when you put it on, you can feel and carry those stories with you. So it fills a void within you from your own ancestry and makes a person whole. Because it's very hard to pretend to be somebody else to fit in. And
And it's no use doing that because you never learn to live or you never learn to be who you are.
Dung tili ki tlinchun disi dung diyetun tlinchun tili si go kwepa dung hani na gekti dikun matade go hi do tili si go tiong ta go si go gedu inne dani go ting fai dung hani go di amme he yenadi Hunti esta gidi da hani ta dung Tlicho lagi di. Han ko wo ga de cha tung de ni di wo ke zan de di je dung ya je se ko ani si. Gu na wo go ge la da go ge la da ki ke ho ga de ge twang gi wo ga go ni na so ni de.
The teaching is about it's okay to be who you are. And you were already strong before this thing happened. You had the ability to pass it on to future generations. And if there's any other challenges from the outside, you're standing together to put your best foot forward to meet those challenges so that those developments don't destroy you, but make you stronger.